The porch groaned under Owen's weight as dusk bled purple and gray across the snow-covered plains of the Montana Territory. It was Christmas Eve, and a bitter wind sang a lonely hymn through the eaves of his cabin, whipping sharp flakes of snow against the weathered wood. The cabin was a solid place, built with good bones by his own hands, but it was filled with ghosts. It had been 3 long years since Martha was taken from him, caught in the crossfire of a life he'd traveled 1,000 miles out here to bury. 3 years of a crushing silence, where the only sounds were the hungry crackle of the hearth and the restless shifting of his horse, Atlas, in the barn. He was a gunslinger trying to forget the familiar, deadly weight of a pistol in his hand. A man whose name, not so long ago, was whispered in fear from the dustiest saloons in the south to the high country passes of the north. Now, he was just a man haunted by the echo of laughter in empty rooms and the scent of a woman's perfume on a pillow that had long gone cold. The silence was a sickness, and he was dying from it. The notice he'd seen nailed to the general store post had been a desperate, practical impulse, an act born of a loneliness so profound it had become a physical ache. A shipment of labor from the east, men and women indentured to the railroad, now to be auctioned to the highest bidder. It was a cruel, ugly transaction, the buying and selling of human lives, but the loneliness was a cruelty of its own, a slow and steady poison seeping into his soul. He needed another heartbeat in the house, a presence to fight back the suffocating silence. He hadn't allowed himself to think beyond that simple, desperate need. He rode into the small, huddled town of Bitterroot as the church bells began to ring for the evening service. Torches had been stuck into the snowbanks around the makeshift platform in the center of town, casting a flickering, hellish light on the proceedings. A small crowd had gathered, stamping their feet against the biting cold, their breath pluming like smoke in the frigid air. The auctioneer, a man with a greasy smile and a voice like gravel, was shouting over the wind, his words a harsh roar against the encroaching night. At the center of the platform stood a line of shivering, gaunt-faced people, their eyes vacant with despair. At the very end of the line, set apart from the others, stood 2 young Chinese women. They were identical twins, so alike it was startling. Both were bound in heavy iron chains at the wrist and ankle, the black metal a stark and brutal contrast against their thin cotton clothes. They were small, delicate figures against the vast, unforgiving landscape, yet they stood with an impossible stillness. The crowd jeered, tossing insults like stones, their laughter sharp and cruel. Owen felt a familiar cold anger tighten in his gut, a feeling he had tried so hard to leave behind. "What are we supposed to do with a pair of them?" a man scoffed from the crowd. "Ain't even big enough for proper farm work, the 2 of them together." The auctioneer's frustration was growing as the bidding remained insultingly low. "Sold as a pair, gentlemen. 2 for the price of 1. Strong, hard-working, and they won't talk back," he bellowed, his smile becoming strained. Owen watched the 2 women. They stood impossibly still, their heads held high, their gazes fixed on some distant point beyond the leering, jeering faces of the crowd. They weren't begging or crying or showing any sign of fear. They were simply enduring, their shared stillness a silent act of defiance. They seemed to draw strength from each other, a silent communication passing between them. $20. Owen's voice, rough and deep from disuse, cut through the murmurs like a blade. The crowd turned as one, surprise registering on their faces. Bannon, a brutish rancher who ran his land with an iron fist and a cruel heart, smirked from the front row. "Well, look what we have here," he spat, his voice dripping with malice. The ghost of Bitterroot, come to buy himself a Christmas present. Or 2, in this case he laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. 25. Owen didn't even glance at him. 50, he said, his eyes still on the 2 women on the platform. A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was far more than anyone had expected to be bid. Bannon's eyes narrowed. This was no longer about the women, it was a challenge, a public contest of wills. 55, Bannon grunted, his face flushing with anger. 100, Owen said, his voice flat and final. The number hung in the frozen air, a clear and undeniable statement. The crowd fell silent. Bannon stared at Owen, his pride warring with his wallet. Finally, with a disgusted laugh, he shook his head. "They're all yours, Gunslinger." Enjoy your broken toys." The auctioneer, stunned but pleased, slammed his gavel down. "Sold. To Mr. Owen for $100. Owen walked up to the platform, the snow crunching under his boots. He handed the money to the auctioneer, ignoring the whispers and the hostile stares of the townsfolk. He stood before the two young women whose names he didn't even know. A guard unlocked their chains, which fell into the snow with a dull, heavy clank. For the first time, they looked at him. As they lifted their heads, the torchlight caught their faces. The left side of each of their faces was flawless, smooth as porcelain despite the grime and the brutal cold. But on the right side, on each of their cheeks just below the eye, was a brand. The same cruel, intricate symbol had been seared into their skin, an identical mark of ownership. Owen's breath caught in his throat. He froze. Every calculated, practical thought he'd had about companionship and ending his solitude vanished. He wasn't looking at cargo or labor. He was looking at survivors, two women who had been through the fire and were still standing, still defiant. Their eyes, dark and deep, held no plea for pity, only a shared, exhausted dignity. He saw in their gaze a reflection of the man he no longer wanted to be, the man who dealt in violence and fear. He simply nodded toward his horse and wagon. "Come on," he said, his voice softer than he intended. They followed him without a word, their steps careful and measured in the deep snow. He helped them onto the wagon seat, his touch brief and impersonal. They both flinched but didn't pull away. As they rode out of town, the sounds of mocking laughter followed them into the growing storm, a cruel Christmas carol on the biting wind. He had just made a choice he didn't fully understand, a choice that had cost him a significant sum of money and the goodwill of his neighbors. As the lights of Bitterroot disappeared behind them, swallowed by the swirling snow, he wondered what kind of damn fool he had just become. The cabin was warm, a stark and welcome contrast to the blizzard that now raged outside. The two sisters stood in the center of the main room, small, still figures dwarfed by the heavy timber beams of the ceiling. They looked around, their eyes cataloguing the sparse bachelor provisions, the layer of dust on the mantel, the unswept floor. Owen watched them from the doorway, a profound sense of uncertainty settling over him. He had bought two people, and now he had no idea what to do with them. "You can get warm by the fire," he offered, his voice awkward in the sudden quiet of the room. They gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in unison and moved toward the hearth. They shed the thin blankets he'd given them for the ride, revealing their worn dresses, mended in a dozen places. They held their hands out to the flames, their backs ramrod straight, their shoulders almost touching. "There's a room," he began, clearing his throat. "Upstairs, the main bedroom. You can take it." "We will take the smallest room," one of them interrupted. Her voice was quiet, with a lilting accent, but her words were clear and precise. She nodded toward a small storage room off the kitchen. "That one is fine." "That's not a proper room," Owen protested. "You should have the bed." The sister who had spoken turned to look at him then, the brand on her cheek stark and angry in the firelight. "Let us be clear, sir. You have bought our labor. We will cook, clean, and mend. Nothing more is expected or offered. A small room is sufficient for servants." Her words were a wall, built of hard experience and bitter resignation. Owen felt a pang of something that felt dangerously like shame. He wanted to argue, to say that it wasn't like that, but what was it like? He had bought them. The ugly, undeniable truth of it stood between them in the warm, fire-lit room. Defeated, he retreated to the barn, the silence of the cabin suddenly more profound and unsettling than when he had been truly alone. Dinner was a silent affair. They had taken the jerky and hardtack he had and softened it in a surprisingly flavorful stew. They cooked with a quiet, synchronized competence that spoke of making much from very little. They ate at the small wooden table, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against tin plates and the relentless howling of the wind outside. "What are your names?" he finally asked, the question feeling loud and intrusive in the heavy silence. "Lynn," said the one who had spoken before, the one who seemed to be the elder by a matter of minutes. "My," whispered the other, not looking up from her plate. "I'm Owen," he said. The silence returned, heavier than before. He knew nothing about them beyond their names and the scars they shared. Nothing of the life they'd led before being put on a platform in chains and sold like cattle. Later, he returned from checking on Atlas to find the door to their small room closed. A thin line of lamplight glowed from underneath it. He lay in his own bed, Martha's bed, listening to the small, unfamiliar sounds of strangers in his home. The soft murmur of voices in a language he didn't understand, the rustle of movement. "What have I done?" he whispered into the darkness. In their small, cramped room, Lynn gently touched the brand on Mai's cheek. It was an old habit, a gesture of comfort. Another master, another cage. But this one was different. He hadn't been cruel. He hadn't touched them. He looked at them with something she couldn't name. Confusion, pity, perhaps even regret. It didn't matter. They had survived worse. They would survive this, together. The days bled into a week. The blizzard passed, leaving the world buried in a pristine, silent blanket of white. Lynn and Mai transformed the cabin. They moved with an unspoken understanding, a fluid and efficient partnership. They found old fabrics in a trunk in the loft and mended the torn curtains. They scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed. The lingering scent of dust and neglect was replaced by the warm, comforting aroma of fresh bread and strong coffee. Owen found himself listening for the soft swish of their movements, the quiet hum of their presence. They were small sounds, but they were chipping away at the suffocating quiet that had defined his life for 3 years. One morning, he came in from the cold, stamping the snow from his boots, to find the winter coat he'd torn on a fence post laid across the table. The seam was repaired with tiny, perfect stitches, stronger than the original. He ran his thumb over the neatness of the work, a feeling of wonder stirring in him. "Our mother taught us to sew," Lynn said quietly from the stove, her back to him. It was the first time either of them had offered a word without being asked a direct question. "Mine, too," he replied, the words feeling inadequate. It was a small, fragile bridge, but it was a start. A week after Christmas, the supplies were running low, and a trip to town became unavoidable. As they hitched the wagon outside the general store, the usual bustle of the street seemed to go quiet. Heads turned. Whispers followed them like shadows. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, a woman whose piety was matched only by her capacity for judgment, stopped them on the boardwalk. Her face was a mask of pious concern. "Mr. Owen," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "We have been praying for you. And for these poor, unfortunate souls." Her eyes, full of a pity that felt more like contempt, lingered on Lynn and Mai. "It is a great act of Christian charity you have performed." Lynn's jaw tightened, and Owen saw her hands ball into small, tight fists at her sides. Mai seemed to shrink into herself, her eyes downcast. "We need supplies, Mrs. Gable," Owen said, his voice a low rumble of warning. He guided the sisters past her and into the store. Inside, the storekeeper's wife stared openly, her mouth agape. 2 young men snickered behind a stack of barrels. Owen felt a slow burn of anger, not at the sisters, but at his neighbors, at himself for bringing them into this crucible of judgment. As they were loading the last of the sacks into the wagon, Bannon blocked their path, his large frame casting a long, dark shadow over them. "Enjoying your purchase, Gunslinger?" His grin was a razor slash in his bearded face. He tipped his hat to Lynn and Mai with a mocking courtesy. "Surprised he let you out in the daylight. Bad for business, a face like that. 2 of them, even worse." Lynn and Mai didn't react, their expressions blank masks as they hoisted a sack of flour into the wagon themselves, working together to manage the weight. "Tell me, Owen," Bannon continued, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial leer. "Do they scream in a language you can understand? Or is that brand on their faces to keep them quiet?" Owen's hand instinctively drifted toward his hip, where his Colt used to hang. The motion was old, familiar, and terrifying in its suddenness. He stopped himself, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. He was trying to be a different man. A quiet man. A man of peace. He said nothing. He just loaded the last of the supplies and climbed into the wagon, motioning for the sisters to join him. Bannon's harsh laughter echoed down the street as they pulled away. The ride home was a long, cold mile of taut silence. Owen's knuckles were white on the reins. He had stood there and let that man insult them, humiliate them. He had chosen peace over their honor. Finally, Lynn's quiet voice broke the tension. "You do not have to defend us." "Maybe I have to defend myself," he said, the words torn from him, raw and honest. She looked at him then, really looked at him for the first time. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but a crack in the wall of her certainty about him. That night, the distance between them felt different. It wasn't just the space between an owner and his property, but the chasm between three people wounded by the same cruel world. He found a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving and poured himself a glass. He sat by the fire long after the sisters had retired to their room. The silence was back, but it felt different now, filled with unspoken questions. He was a man who had built his life on his ability to answer threats with swift, decisive violence. Today, he had chosen silence, and it felt like a betrayal. Later, unable to sleep, he walked to their door. He could hear them speaking softly inside. He raised his hand to knock, to say, "What?" He didn't know. He let his hand fall. As he turned away, the door opened a crack. Lynn stood there, her expression unreadable in the dim light. Mai was visible over her shoulder, her eyes wide. "You are troubled," Lynn stated, her voice soft. "I should have done something," he admitted, his voice low. "Back in town." "Violence is not the only answer," she said. He looked at her, at the scar on her face, a permanent mark of someone else's violence. "Sometimes it is," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. She held his gaze for a long moment. "We have seen enough violence to last a lifetime," she said, before quietly closing the door. The next morning, the fragile piece was shattered. Owen was mending a harness in the barn when Bannon and two of his hired men rode into the yard. Lynn and Mai were hanging laundry, the bright colors of the wet fabric stark against the endless white of the snow. "Owen!" Bannon called out, dismounting with a swagger. "I've come on business. I'll give you 200 for them. Double what you paid. A tidy profit for a week's work." Lynn and Mai froze, their hands still on the clothesline. Owen walked out of the barn, his face a grim, cold mask. "They're not for sale," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Bannon laughed, a humorless, barking sound. "Everything's for sale, Gunslinger. What use do you have for them? You were too much of a coward to defend them in town. You're ashamed of them. I'm doing you a favor." He took a step toward the sisters. "I'll even let you keep the 100 you spent." "Get off my land, Bannon," Owen said, his voice dropping to a low pitch that seemed to silence the wind. "Or what? You going to talk me to death?" Bannon sneered. His men fanned out, their hands resting on the butts of their guns. "You're not the man you used to be." Lynn and Mai looked at Owen, their faces pale, their eyes wide with a fear they hadn't shown even at the auction. They were expecting him to fail again, to trade them away for a profit and a quiet life. Something inside Owen snapped. The quiet man he had been trying to be for 3 years was a lie, a costume that no longer fit. He wasn't protecting himself from his past, he was just letting it win. He took a slow step forward, away from the barn and into the open yard, positioning himself between Bannon and the sisters. "The last man who called me a coward," Owen said, his voice now a deadly whisper, "is buried on a hill outside of Wichita." Bannon's smile faltered. For the first time, he saw not the quiet homesteader he'd been mocking, but the ghost he'd heard whispers about. The man whose name was linked to a dozen graves. "You have 3 seconds to ride out of here," Owen continued, his hand now resting naturally on his empty hip, a gesture so ingrained it was part of him, "before I remind you why people used to lock their doors when they heard my name." Bannon hesitated, his eyes flicking from his men to the cold, deadly certainty in Owen's eyes. He saw no bluff, only a promise. Cursing under his breath, he swung himself back onto his horse. "This ain't over, Gunslinger," he snarled, before spurring his horse and riding away, his men scrambling to follow. The yard was silent again, the only sound the flapping of the laundry on the line. Lynn and Mai stood staring at him, their chests rising and falling rapidly. He had defended them. He had chosen them. He walked over to them, his heart pounding with an adrenaline he hadn't felt in years. "He won't be back," he said, his voice still shaking slightly. "You're safe here." They searched his face, their eyes filled with a confusion that mirrored his own. "Why?" Mai whispered, her voice barely audible. "Because this is your home," he said, the words feeling truer and more real than anything he'd said in 3 long years. That night, for the first time, they left their door ajar. And for the first time in 3 years, Owen slept without dreaming of ghosts. The spring thaw came late that year, but when it did, it transformed the land. Green shoots pushed their way through the mud, and the creek swelled with melted snow. They planted a garden together, working side by side in the warm, rich earth. He showed them how to till the stubborn soil, and they showed him how to space the seeds, a skill learned in a faraway home they never spoke of. Their hands often brushed, sending a jolt through him that had nothing to do with the cold ground. A comfortable silence grew between the 3 of them, a silence that was no longer empty but filled with a shared understanding, more eloquent than words. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of orange and purple, Mai, on an impulse, leaned her head against his shoulder. Owen went absolutely still, every muscle in his body tensed. He could smell the faint scent of soap and wood smoke in her hair. Slowly, hesitantly, he raised his hand and touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. She didn't pull away. He then gently traced the edge of the brand on her cheek. She flinched, a barely perceptible tremor. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "It is a part of me," she said, her voice low. "It is a part of us," Lynn corrected softly from his other side. She reached out and took his hand, guiding it to her own cheek, pressing his fingers against the identical scar. "But it is not who we are." His eyes held theirs, and in their depths, he saw not pity or shame, but a raw, aching tenderness that mirrored the growing feeling in his own chest. He looked from one to the other, at these 2 women who had endured so much, who had brought life back into his silent home. The ghosts of their pasts and his own rose between them, a palpable presence in the cooling air. Fear returned, the fear of pain, of loss, of letting someone in again only to have them torn away. He saw that same fear reflected in their eyes. Later that night, a soft knock came at his bedroom door. He opened it to find both sisters standing there, their expression solemn. "There is something you must see," Lynn said. "If you are to be our home, you must know what you are sheltering." He followed them to their small room. By the light of a single lamp, they turned their backs to him and, with hesitant movements, helped each other unbutton the high collars of their dresses. They pulled the fabric down, exposing their shoulders. And there, on the back of each sister, was another brand. It was a different symbol, larger and more ornate, but clearly from the same cruel iron. Owen's breath hitched. He had thought the marks on their faces were the extent of it, a mark of ownership. But this was something else. This was a mark of lineage, of belonging to something, like cattle in a herd. "We were born into service," Mai whispered, her voice trembling. "To a man who believed beauty was his to own and to mark as he pleased." "He collected beautiful things," Lynn added, her voice hard as stone. "And he did not like his possessions to be marred. The mark on our faces. That was a punishment. For a transgression he deemed worthy of spoiling his collection." Owen felt a cold, murderous rage rise in him, so powerful it made him dizzy. He reached out, his hand hovering over the scarred skin, not wanting to cause them more pain. He gently, reverently, traced the edges of the brands, first on Lynn's back, then on Mai's. He wasn't just touching a scar, he was touching their history, their pain, their resilience. He looked at them, at their mirrored faces, at the shared trauma etched into their very skin, and the last of his own walls crumbled. He spent the rest of the night on a chair in the corner of their room, watching over them as they slept, a silent, self-appointed guardian. He was no longer just a man who had bought 2 servants. He was a man who had been entrusted with the safety of 2 survivors. And he would not fail them again. The circuit preacher married them the following Sunday. It was a quiet ceremony, held on the porch of the cabin that was now truly their home. The marriage license, listing Owen as the husband to both Lynn and Mai, was a strange document, one the preacher had to be heavily persuaded to sign, but it hung on the wall, a testament to the unconventional family they had become. That evening, the golden light of the sunset washed over them as they sat together, the thriving garden they had planted a testament to their shared work. Next year, Owen said, his arm around Mai's shoulders while Lynn leaned against his other side, we'll add chickens. Mai leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. Maybe a child, she said softly. Hope, once a terrifying stranger, had become a welcome guest in their home. The real covenant of their union wasn't written on the paper hanging on the wall, but in the rich soil of their garden, in their shared silences, and in the courageous choice to face their fears together. Do you ever regret it? Lynn asked, her voice thoughtful as she traced the stitching on his shirt. That day at the auction. Owen was quiet for a moment, watching the first stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. Every day, he said. He felt them both stiffen slightly. He turned to them, his gaze unwavering and full of a love he never thought he would feel again. I regret every day I wasted before it, he clarified, his voice thick with emotion. I should have found you sooner. He kissed them then, first Lynn, then Mai, a kiss that spoke of blizzards weathered and futures planted. The gunslinger had finally found a reason to lay his weapons down for good, and the women who had been sold in chains had finally found a place to be free. The spring had come late to their corner of Montana, but it had come to stay.